This is the Survivance time capsule for Chicagoland Alana. We are here with Angela Hurlock, and we'd like to share her story. Please, Angela, introduce yourself to our audience.
So my name is Angela Hurlock, and I am the executive director for Clarisha and Associates, which is a community development corporation on the far southeast side of Chicago. That is my official role. My unofficial role is I'm a wife of 16 years, and my husband is an immigrant here and immigrated to the country as an adult. And then I'm a mom. I have a 10-year-old young boy, Black boy, that's being raised in southeast Chicago.
So take us to February 2020. Life is what it is. What's happening in your home and what's happening in Chicago Clarisha and Associates community?
Wow, I'm thinking back in February of 2020. I got a third grader at home who is looking forward to finishing out the third grade and moving into the fourth grade. We are vehemently working towards closing on one of our largest projects to date. At that point in time, we were going to be closing on the South Chicago YMCA, which is 101 units of affordable senior housing plus 40,000 square feet of community space. And for us, going into 2021 being our 30th year, February of 2020 was definitely a time of looking towards, man, we are going to have this new place, a new location, moving our offices, co-locating, so many things, and just a lot of excitement, super excitement. And then blam, the pandemic.
COVID happens to all of us. So take us now to March. You're settling in and it's the first week in March. We still don't know that the pandemic is happening. What's going on in the home and with Clarisha?
In March of 2020, we were really beginning to focus on our summer programs. Once March hits, it's the end of the first quarter of the year, and we are looking towards, July and August and having the kids be very active in the community. And so in March of 2020, we were actively thinking about what are we going to do for the summer, expecting it to be a super hot summer. And so, hey, we need to make sure that our kids have something to do.
Mm-hmm.
And how we not only have these employment programs, but how we're really going to actively involve them in civic engagement and in the community and being able to just do fantastic things. In addition to that, summer is a major time when people start moving around. And so really thinking about how we're working with our families, how we're providing for them, are their needs going to be met over the summer? Some of our most crucial families or critical families their employment is tied around like being off during the summer because their kids have to be off, or that lunch lady at the school doesn't work during the summer and those types of things. And so we began to think about how can we make sure that their summers aren't going to be dismal? How can we make sure that our kids that are eating in school every day, but now school's out, how are we going to have food for them? And those types of things. And so those are the types of things we were beginning to think about during March 2020.
And so then the pandemic happens. Not only do you go into, I imagine, emergency mode, not only at home, settling home because your child is no longer in school, and then also with the balance of running this nonprofit organization. Can you speak to that? The pandemic happens.
Wow. Once the pandemic hit, it was just amazing. First of all, I think like any family, we were thinking about, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to stay at home. We're not supposed to come over our house. This is like one of those crazy movies where you expect zombies to start coming out of the woodwork and things like that. We began to think about, okay, if everybody has to stay home, how are our kids going to have access to school? Broadband on the southeast side is so challenged. And so if, they have access to internet, do they have access to the devices that they need to actually be actively in school? And so we began to think about, how are we making sure that our kids can continue to manage through the rest of the year and finish strong? They're already, we fight against just the normal deficits educationally that can occur in our neighborhood. So now taking the kids out of school where they're used to being and they're used to learning and create a new type of learning for them was definitely challenging on a personal level, even with my own son, just the dynamic of how do we continue to help him to learn when he's no longer in a classroom, he's in the kitchen, and then what do I do? Even as a mom, I had more flexibility. My husband and I had a little more flexibility because he works for an educational, he works for a college. And so the classes were out and he works in the laboratories. And so he was out. There weren't any labs going on. So they had also had him come home. So we were a little bit of an advantage that both of us were home and I could come back and forth and kind of navigate. But as a community, we were looking at the families that couldn't navigate that work aspect. If you're working in the service industry, how do you do that from home? You don't. If you're working, even with our safe passage folks, if you're working for the school and the school is now closed, that's income that you are desperately missing. And there were really dynamic programs that CPS thought up initially to kind of keep folks working because that economy needed to continue to flow. However, then you ran the risk of, if I'm working, who's keeping my kids? And we had dynamics where we had to work with families and counsel families around, you have two adults, or, maybe it's not a married situation, but maybe it's two sisters who are living together with their kids. You got to figure out who makes more. So who gets to go to work? Because what's going to be the detriment to the family if you work or your income is missing versus my income is missing. And so there were various different kind of conversations that we had to have around that, including, again, because a significant proportion of our kids, they eat at school. They qualify for the free lunch. If they're not at school, how are they eating? So you're already having challenges keeping food on the table, but now you have these young mouths that are home. My son is at the refrigerator every 20 minutes talking about, I'm hungry. So what's going on? How are you managing that? And so really kind of counsel families through that and finding resources for families through that. And so it was really dynamic that we had partners that locked shields with us and said, you know what? We know you got to keep people housed. We know you got to keep people fed. This is what we're going to do. And they gave us money to our discretion to be able to work with families in whatever way we could come up with. And so we had to come up with unique ways to minimize people coming together, meaning we didn't want you to come into the office because you're supposed to stay home and stay safe. But we need to get whatever proof you have that you qualify to get this money. We need to figure out how to get in contact with your landlord to say you're behind on your rent. We need to get in contact with you to get you this gift card so that you can go to the grocery store and buy some food for your kids. Those types of things, we had to be very dynamic and think outside the box of how we could have people text, how we could have people email. Could they scan stuff? What could we do virtually to make sure that we had a low threshold for people to meet, but there was still an opportunity for us to meet the need of the folks. I mean, the threshold, the bar couldn't be, super high. You couldn't turn in 5 different things and you got to go over to DFSS and get this and come bring your birth certificate. And it couldn't be all of that. It really had to be things that you could easily access so that we could meet your critical, immediate, basic needs.
Let's talk about some of the responses that Claretian Associates specifically received. I understand that Claretian has designated all of the properties under your control are designated as food security spaces, meaning people know on a regular day that they can come and get food at designated places that are Claretian Associates controlled. Can you speak to that, please?
So one of the first things we had to think about was how we looked at our spaces because we had different developments. We had up to 200 families that were living spread across 5 different developments. And how did we make for designated food security folks, food security spaces? How did we make for people to be able to pick up food, emergency food, if they just didn't have it? And so some of our initial partners not only provided those monies, but some of our partners provided that food. And so then our staff would get and staff these bags. And we created at one of our developments, we were able to create an emergency food pantry. And so families could just come down and get a box of food to provide them and to carry them over until they would be able to do something else. And so whether it was a gift card, whether it was money, whether it was a check made out to their landlord or something like that, we had to come up with various different ways to meet the needs as they presented themselves. Families might say, I don't have any food. And so come into the pantry, and we had our social service coordinators go into the pantry. How many kids you have? How many families do you have? And they're pulling food for that amount of families. Or when we were able to get a little bit more organized and we had the gift cards, if your family was of a certain size, say for instance, it was a one person family, we may be able to give you a $50 gift card. But if it was two, it was suddenly 100. If it was three or four or five, it got up to like 200, 250 because you needed to feed yourself. And they were in gift card form, so you could easily take it to the store and use it wherever, those types of things. So again, we had to think about how to make it simple, easy, accessible, and on the go, because people were already afraid of being outside. They were already at risk. This was a time period when it was Black and brown people were the ones who were the largest percentage of folks contracting the disease, because they had no choice but to be out and about in the mix of everything. Their jobs weren't transferable to being at home. They were in the service industry, though they didn't have a car, so they had to take public transportation. Everybody was figuring out how this new life was going to run, and yet the disease and the virus was running rampant through all of that. And so amongst the fear, amongst the challenges, it was just definitely the first few months in March and April and May were just, it was unbelievable. It was like living in a movie.
Indeed. So outside of all of that that's happening and trying to support your residents and all of those kind of basic needs for those residents, as well as the community at large, because Claretian Associates is a community catch-all in the South Chicago community, as well as in its neighboring communities in South Shore, South Deering, and some other places. So you're an anchor institution for all definitions, but you still do community development. You announced that you had the largest project that you've ever done in the history of the organization happening in the pandemic. How does one develop a project in a pandemic when you have to have safety concerns? And do you do construction? How does that work? What did that look like and what did that feel like?
Yeah, as an anchor institution, this is the everyday thing. Every day today, you're providing food, you're housing folks and that kind of thing. And then you have this amazing project, biggest project we've ever done today. And you have to think about, okay, we've closed on it. Now we got to actually construct it. We're going to have, 20 construction people in the building at the same time with 100 seniors. How do you do that? There are all kind of protocols that we had to begin to think about. Our contractors had to think about, our architects had to think about, how do you have a normal site visit? Everyone has to wear masks. We began to think about just the, critical things. And, everyone was watching the CDC and, everybody has to wear a mask and we have to take temperatures and you have to do a check in, like, have you felt ill? What's going on? That type of thing. Then also, because we're working with seniors and they're a frailty, you have to make sure that how are you crossing the senior? They're going into seniors' apartments. How does that happen? How do you set up for those things? And so we had to be very intentional around creating hospitality suites where a senior could go and spend the day while the contractors were in their office. But then we also had to have cleaning crews that came in after the contractors left to make sure that everything was sanitized. We had to make sure that we were sanitization just by itself, like cleaning, went to an all high, making sure that people had what they need to just keep themselves clean and keep the prevalence of the virus down. That was even just challenging. And because we're not scientists, we're not, I don't know anything about science. So, having to really stay on the cutting edge of whatever the CDC said, of whatever the public health department said, how do we do that? That definitely was a time where it was just like, we just have to keep up. We have no choice. We have to keep up. We have to keep moving. We have to keep people fed, housed, sanitized, in school, access the internet, on, going wherever they need to go and getting those things that they needed, and continue to build, because some of the monies that we had, they had timelines on them. They're markers that are on them that say, you have to have these units in service by a certain date. And there are investors, because it's low-income housing tax credits, there are investors that are waiting for some of those units to come in the space for different compliances to go on board. So it's a lot of intricacy. And it was really good that it was a blessing that we had partners that we were working with, that we all kind of had to take a chunk and say, okay, you worry about this, you worry about this, and we really just had to jump in and do the best we could.
Talk to us about the project. What's its name? How did you get the name? and the unique demographics of the South Chicago community?
Our wonderful project is called the Salud Center, and salud is a Spanish word for health. And we actually have been doing a lot of work around the social determinants of health. When folks think about health, they think about medicine, they think about doctors, nurses, did I get your flu shot and things like that. But there are so many things that determine how healthy you are that have nothing to do with a medical doctor. Housing, for instance, what you eat, for instance. Are you able to walk within your community? Or is there public transportation? Are there safe spaces for you to spend time in? What is your stress level? All of those things play into, and more, play into the social determinants of health. And so when we were thinking about the Salud Center, one, when the YMCA closed in the fall of 2017, we were in horror because that was the main place that kids went safely, seniors could go safely, our community could go safely. And our community, the demographics of our community it's very diverse, not only in age from youth to elderly, but also in race and nativeness. Like we are still a gateway community into Chicago and into the country. So we have a lot of people that are coming from a lot of different countries, largely Latino, like, Mexico and Puerto Rico, also largely African and Caribbean as well. And so all of our a couple, not all, but there are some significant stores in our commercial district that cater to the fact that we have such diversity. So they are, supplying food and fruits and vegetables that come from these very distinct countries, because that's the families that are here. So we were in dismay that, hey, this entity, this building that was a safe haven for our kids, a safe haven of activity for our health component, was closing. And so we were able to garner a national partner to help us to buy the building and then bring it back online. But our thoughts about what's going in that building, it is all about your health. It's about your mental health, your financial health, your physical health, your intellectual health. It is about wealth building. It's not only going to have health services where you can come and, take an exercise class of some sort or play basketball and those types of things, but you can also come and, we're having talks about how do we create a active youth center, a teenage center where teens can stop in and stop through, and youth can come in and do dynamic programming and just hang out with each other. We're also talking about a small business incubator center so that small businesses, you might have a home-based business and you need to move it out of your home. You need to have a legitimate office where you can have mail come to. You need to have a place where you can reserve a conference room to have a meeting because you're growing your business. And those are all wealth building and growing strategies that we're trying to help small businesses with. It also has an innovation lab, which will have about 30 computers where we'll be able to do trainings for folks so they can increase their capacity. Because that's another thing that we learned during the last year, that as people were getting laid off or they were underscheduled. You might have had 40 hours before, now you have 30 hours, now you have 15 hours, now you have 20 hours. You have time on your hands. You don't have money coming in, you have less money coming in, and you need a greater skill set. So we actually transferred to starting to work with families, not only providing rental and food relief for them, but saying, how can we connect you to build your skill set so that you can come out of this pandemic intellectually and employably better than you went in. And so we've been fortunate to work with another nonprofit that does workforce development training to be able to connect people, again, not only to the rental assistance and the food assistance, but to actually getting training and certifications in different things. So they can come out of this, they've been able to go get better jobs during this pandemic, right? As things started to get better, people started to hire again, they found themselves in better predicaments because now they have a certification around something. Now they have a Microsoft Suite certification. So now maybe I don't have to just go back to the restaurant. I can get an office job somewhere, and that gives me the ability to possibly still be able to segue some type of remote working because my kid's still at home, right? And so those were the things that we were thinking about. How do we do that? And it's not just now. I mean, the pandemic definitely made us think about it sooner. But those were also the things we were thinking about going into the new building. Like that was the things we were beginning to vet and plan for. And the pandemic was like the panacea that made us say, get it even quicker and on straight and actually pilot some of these projects and co-projects that we had wanted to do.
Thank you for that. In an article that you wrote in February 2018, you call it the 6 blocks. Ever since I've read this article, any chance I get, I mention this. And I'd like to start by that first paragraph. Life for more children takes place within a 6-block radius of their home: school, shopping, worship, and play. These 6 blocks help define who they are, what they do, and what they become. If this 6-block radius changes every few months, what are the odds of that child gaining stability and sense of worth? I can only imagine that during this pandemic, as a wife and a mother, and then into what you do largely for Claretian Associates. And let's also mention that you're on the board for Chicago, Greater Chicago Affordable Housing as well. How important are these 6 blocks? And if you could talk about your evolution to your 6 blocks, what was your 6 blocks made of? I know your grandmother from the evolution of the Great Migration. So if you could start there and pick us up, I'd really appreciate that.
So this theory about 6 blocks, I was able to write an article back in, I think it was 2018, about 6 blocks and my ideas around 6 blocks and my history of 6 blocks. And when I say 6 blocks, what I mean by that is the circumference of 6 blocks is usually where children learn who they are, how they live, what their self-worth is. It's where they not only live, so they physically live there, but it's where they play. It's where they worship. It's where they go to school. It's where their friends are. It's where they see and experience the world. And so within that 6 blocks, ask yourself, what are my children? I ask myself this all the time now that I have a 10-year-old. What is my son seeing? Who is the largest earner in that 6 block? What are the industries in those 6 blocks? Can he ride his bicycle safely in those 6 blocks? Is he allowed to walk to the local playground within those 6 blocks? It really has a serious effect on, as children are growing up, their trajectory and what they believe they can be. My personal history, my grandmother moved my mom here. Both my grandparents actually came from the South. They were born in the South, my dad in Arkansas, my mom in Mississippi, and their parents brought them here as young children during the Great Migration of the 40s and the 50s. And my great-grandmother and my grandmother came together with my grandmother's 6 children. And my great-grandmother was born in 1896, and I knew her well. She didn't pass till I was 21 in the 90s. And so it was such a blessing to be able to have that understanding of kind of how they migrated to create a better life for their family. And so then my parents were raised here in Chicago, and then I was born here in Chicago. So Chicago native and born, first generation. My parents decided I remember when I was 5, we lived on the corner of a very a busy thoroughfare, and across the street was my school. And my dad picked me up from kindergarten one day and thought, I don't know what he thought, but what he definitely thought was, I do not want my child to grow up in this. And he moved us. And he moved us approximately 6 blocks to what was a different neighborhood. And that trajectory of simple 6 blocks opened up like a whole new world for me. Where I went to school changed. All of the people within my near vicinity went to the same school consistently. Most of the folks were homeowners that my parents bought a home using my dad's VA loan because he was a Vietnam vet. And so the consistency of now being a homeowner from a renter, the consistency of everybody pretty much going to the same school from kindergarten to 8th grade, and then on to the same middle school, and then on to the same high school. Whereas now that's not happening for kids. I have friends where they have multiple children and they all go to different schools outside of the neighborhood. So that 6 blocks has now become, 2 miles, 3 miles, 5 miles, 8 miles. When you're within those 6 blocks, you can set your roots down and begin to work on those other things. I realized that because my parents created a very stable 6 blocks for us, we knew our friends, we knew where we went to school, we knew we could walk to the park, we could do all these things. We could focus on being children. We didn't have to worry about whether we were going to eat or not that night. And it didn't change. And then now we work with families that are just very challenged, and their 6 blocks may change, periodically throughout a year. I have a girlfriend who literally just shared with me this weekend. We were talking and she said she remembers one year where within a 12-month period, their family moved 22 times. 22 times. Now she is now a business owner and doing quite well, her and her husband, and they have 3 kids. But that trajectory of all that instability could have created a lot of different things in her, could have created a totally lot of different things. And she was fortunate to gain towards the end of her life a little bit more stability. But think about moving just once in a year, how traumatic it can be for a child. 22 times within 1 year, within a 12-month period. That means like almost every other week that you are moving, you're shifting, and that might not have been from one apartment to another apartment like you are renting an apartment, but you could have been couch surfing, sharing an apartment with another family. You're living with this family for these 2 weeks, and then you got to move over here with this family for 2 weeks. And so homelessness and housing insecurity is very, very much real. And so again, creating a 6 blocks of safety, even within the 6 blocks we live now, I live a block from our office, creating a space where my son can ride his bike. Do we go outside? Because then if your kids are trapped indoors, again, social determinants of health. Now you start dealing with childhood obesity, and because they're not getting the exercise that children just need. They're trapped to a computer most of the day, and then they're trapped on Fortnite when they get off of that on some kind of game. And it can create a lot of anxiety, a lot of challenges. But then also, what do they see? What do they dream? The cliche is you can only be what you can see. Well, what do you see in that 6 blocks? If the highest earner in that 6 block, is it someone who goes to work every day, who is going to, receive someday a pension and, Social Security? Or is it someone who has found an economy outside of the legal status? What is the respect level? Who has money, who doesn't have money? Who has education, who doesn't have education? It's all those things that get wrapped up into the 6 blocks conundrum for me. That whole concept of 6 blocks and creating 6 blocks is why I feel like I'm here. Like I feel like God gave me the purpose of being where I am and the privilege of serving where I am to make this 6 blocks the best 6 blocks that it can be. And so that's why we not only deal with housing, but we also deal with wealth building, and we deal with food insecurity, and we deal with all these different things that should go into a 6 blocks. We have active partnerships with the local schools, and we create open urban spaces and parks and things like that. Our next couple of projects are not only residential, but again, they co-locate a lot of different things in them. They co-locate healthy workout spaces and training facilities and grocery stores and those types of things and amenities that families need, not only want, but families need. We're creating a community of choice, not a community of last resort. And so I think for a long time, folks have thought about South Chicago as a community of last resort, and we don't want that. We want folks to choose to live here because they see the amazingness of it. My office and my home as well is less like 2 blocks from Lake Michigan. Who has that? It's a small hidden gem, and we're trying to make it the best that it possibly can be for the families that live here, because we know eventually other families will move here too. And we know how gentrification and migration is, and we want it to be great now and continue to be great for families that are here now and the families that will come. And we want families to be able to stay here for as long as they choose to, from inception to transition. We want you to have an opportunity to live in South Chicago.
Amazing.
I think one important point that always resonates with me and is a driving force within me is that I realize how much my family sacrificed for the next generation. And that is how many families are. Knowing my great grandmother, who was born, before the 19th century, 1896, and being able to hear her story of being born on a plantation, hear her story from her mouth, instilled in me some amazing things. And then hear my grandmother's story about, only finishing the 8th grade because she needed to get married to provide stability, housing stability for my grandmother at 14. And then hearing how she, after having 6 kids, moved her and my grandmother here to Chicago, again, for a better life on an 8th grade education, and was so proud that all of her children had gone to high school. And then my parents having me and my sister and saying, our children will go to college. And now I have a 10-year-old and I've moved into the city, into a neighborhood that I didn't necessarily grow up in, but that I love dearly, and that it has embraced my family, the innateness of my family, the variety of my family. I'm married to an immigrant, and I have a little brown boy, and and has embraced all those things, all those microcosms of who I am. And I look at my neighbors, and I think they want the same thing I want. I want better for my next generation. I want to provide a place where my son can walk around and know that wherever he is, he belongs. He is exactly where he is meant to be, a community of choice. And I think that that's what this community deserves. It deserves no less. My family deserves no less. Every other family here deserves no less. But we all just want to make it better for the next generation. And I think that's what makes me drive to do the things that we do, whether it's here on the local level through Clarisha and Associates, or even as the chair of CHA for all kinds of families throughout Chicago. That is super important. My name is Angela Hurlock, and I am a wife. I'm a mom. I'm the executive director of Clarisha and Associates. I'm the chair for the Chicago Housing Authority, and this is my story of survivance.